stockholders report to Alaskans. We've been doing this for a period of time because if you take a look at the rhythm of civic groups in this town, you'll know that another fine organization has an Anchorage economic development forecast that tells us how many new jobs or how many lost jobs we have in the coming, in the year around us. And then there's another look at Alaska's overall trade picture. The Commonwealth North was founded by two governors, our first and second governors, Bill Egan and Wally Hickle, who said that whatever we have, whatever our political differences are, we also own a lot of assets as a state. As was considered during the Constitutional Convention, we have a constitution that looks at us as an owner state. We are reminded from time and again that the issue is not just getting people to help us develop our resources, but making sure that some people don't tie up our resources and promise to develop them and not take them. We've got lots of different assets, and so today's meeting is going to tell us how our assets are performing. We also know that our assets have been and will continue to be a huge player in funding our government. Part of the argument to get our assets in statehood 60 years ago was that Alaska couldn't pay its bills on taxes alone. That revenues and the sale of our resources were very important, and given the challenging times that we've got in Juneau right now and some of the very tough decisions on the table in Juneau, I think it's important to recognize and review what we own. So we're going to track performance, and at this time I'd like to introduce our head table. We have Bruce Tangeman, who's the new Commissioner of Revenue. Bruce, thank you for joining us. And we have Jim Johnsen, who's the President of the University of Alaska, and has also been nominated to be a member of our Board of Directors. Jim, thank you for being here. We have Bryan Butcher, who is former Commissioner of Revenue and CEO and Executive Director of the Alaska Housing Finance Corporation. Bryan, thank you. To my left, we have Craig Richards, who is Chair of the Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation and former Attorney General, and also a nominated member of the Board of Trustees. So thank you very much, Craig, for joining us. And then we have my successor, Board Member Terry Smith, who is about to take on the leadership of Commonwealth North. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our head table. I'd also like to thank Northrim Bank for sponsoring today's program. Northrim has been a long-time supporter of Commonwealth North and of this annual program in particular. And I don't think Joe Beadle's here today, but had it not been for Joe's push over the years, I don't think we would have this strong program. And I'd like to thank Northrim for their support today. Now I'm going to Now, would members of Commonwealth North please stand? I'd like to personally thank you for your membership in this organization. The tremendous work that you're doing and the support to educate Alaskans, including our policy leaders. Now you may sit. And for those of you who didn't stand, and I'm looking at several of you I know fairly well, I'd like to extend the invitation to join Commonwealth North. And I don't think there's ever been a more important time in the history of our state where we need bipartisan, good, solid public policy review as we meet the challenges before us. And support for this organization would be graciously received, and we know there's work for you to be done. I also want to just say that we have question cards. I've already got one question coming up, which I'm actually going to read before I introduce our speakers. But if you have questions for our speakers, please fill out the question cards, hold them up, and Jim or Aaron will pick them up and bring them forward. If you have cell phones, please put them on stun, and let's get started. Alright, so as this 13th annual report comes up, it's a report on the value, income, and prospects of our key commonly owned assets for the preceding year. And we have a few asset managers here today, and we want them to give us criteria that they should be judged upon in the coming year. And I'm also going to read the question. One of the questions that's come forward already is, what assets should or could Alaska sell to cover near-term revenue gaps? So that's something you asset managers might think about. They see two asset managers who produce huge cash dividends, and one asset manager who produces huge dividends for the economy, and one asset manager who makes sure that all the dividends that we have come. So here, that's a good question. Is there anything you want to sell? Just to remember, at the time of statehood, the question was, could Alaska support itself? And we have about 375 million acres in this state, and the patchwork quilt of land ownership now has federal land, state land, local land, a large role of Alaska Native corporations, and I hope soon, Jim, a larger role for the university as a landowner, being one of our first land grant university without its land. But as an owner state, we manage our resources as natural resources available for sale, lease, or conservation. We also have financial assets that are intended to produce a financial return. And third, we have enterprises included to produce both financial return and key infrastructure. And in the past in this program, we've had people such as the head of the Alaska Aerospace Development Corporation, the Alaska Marine Highway, other enterprises that, like the Anchorage International Airport, or the International Airport System, that also produce a return and have key infrastructure. The news that we have today is that in the last year, our total gross state product actually fell 0.5% from 2016 to 2017. $51.5 billion was our GSP, our gross state product. The national average was up 2.2%. And it's an issue here in Alaska is what kinds of drivers are going to actually help us grow the economy again. Per capita personal income in 2017 was $57,179 per person in the state. That's up 2.3% from 2016, and 100% of the national average of 51,600. What's interesting for us as people looking at the state assets is that actually Alaska's assets themselves gained over 3% in value. And today, I can tell you this is not an announcement of your dividend. It's not an announcement of anything, but it is part of what you might consider the net worth that you can't put on your own balance sheet, but has a whole lot to do with your state's economy. Each individual Alaskan share of the assets that we own together that we're able to put a tag on, and that does not include, say, an acre's value of the land that we own, for example. But each Alaskan share is $97,163, which is up from somewhere around about $86,000, $87,000. It's a considerable number to be aware of. And as we look at our state budget situation, our economy, which we've got to see grow and so forth, I think Alaskans should know that a family of four is a beneficiary of almost $400,000 in assets before you look at the value of our land. And that's considerable. When we look at natural resources, and remember we said we're going to look at natural resources, we're going to look at financial assets, and we're going to look at enterprises. Our natural resources, I like to say, are coal, fisheries, gas, land, minerals, nature, oil, tidelands, timber, water, critters, and wind. And that's only some. I'm sure you can think of some others. And at the Department of Natural Resources and at the Department of Fish and Game, we're trying to see generation of income from those assets and also generation of employment and investment in the state. Our fisheries, we can measure several different ways, but the tax value on our fisheries is up from $65 million to $78 million. This number includes almost $25 million for fisheries business and resource landing taxes, and $53 million in tax revenue designated to municipal sharing and other fisheries management and marketing. And we include these pass-through dollars because they're subject to appropriation. A higher total catch value contributed to this increase in tax revenue over 2017. Bruce, let's hope you get more next year. The Division of Parks, it's hard to put a specific value on our parks, but one thing that we tag is what is the budget for our parks and what's the revenue from user fees. Our user fee revenue actually went down in fiscal year 18. The total budget also went down. The amount of land that we have designated as parkland in the state stayed about the same, and has stayed about the same for some time. But the visitor numbers are not yet available, but as you can see, there's been a trend of increasing visitor numbers at our state parks, and we've seen some new facilities go into state parks, such as the facilities around Valley State Park, and some pretty cool options for hut-to-hut systems and new trails, so we'll see what happens there. The Division of Mining, Land and Water, met with the Deputy Commissioner yesterday, who oversees that division, Brent Goodrum. We've got about 100.5 million acres, less 2.2 million acres conveyed, so we've got 98.3 of our 103 million acre statehood entitlement in hand. The amount of land that we've got leased is down in FY18 to about 5 million acres from 5.3, but actually more leases, 2,094 leases this year compared to last year. This is a map that DNR publishes a couple of times a year, and I know I download it fairly often. It's also one that you might want to look at, but there is quite a bit of activity on the North Slope happening with perceived stability in oil prices and new opportunities, new discoveries, and we'll hear more about that in a second. What this amounts to is petroleum general fund revenues, and as you can see from that slide, let's look at the number, because we saw a big jump between 2017 and 2018. We went from $867 million in petroleum fund revenues up to $1.9 billion. And we still have a $1.6 billion deficit. Of the unrestricted revenue, it's down a little bit to $466 million. But our royalties went up from $676 to $977 million. The severance tax went up considerably from $125 million to $750 million. The petroleum corporate income tax, where we had a loss due to credits, so about $68 million there. We still have not paid all the credits that we have, so I'm not sure that that's reflected there. But put it in this way, in FY 2018, our petroleum revenue accounted for 80% of unrestricted revenue. The prediction is, and Bruce, you may want to talk to some of this in terms of the prediction thing. We had a fiscal meeting scheduled to look at prediction. It's expected to be 32% by FY 2028, 10 years from now. Lower than historical share due, including a portion of the permanent fund as unrestricted revenue beginning in FY 19. Increases in the petroleum corporate income tax, severance tax, and royalty are generally a response to price and volume increases. And we follow that at Commonwealth North with the Energy Action Coalition led by board member Marianne Peace, and we invite you to join those meetings. I'm now going to turn over the slides to Bruce and let him start with a description of financial assets. As you know, we have a number of financial assets in the state, and our revenue commissioner sits on many of these authorities, and it's up to you, Bruce. Take us down. Thank you.
Thank you, Mead. It's a pleasure to be part of this presentation today. We choreographed this quite well because you did touch on a couple slides that I did not include. I'm going to hit on a few slides. The governor's certainly asking us that when we have these opportunities to speak to groups like this to talk about the budget process and a lot of the things that are in the paper right now. I know there's a lot of shock and awe out there right now, but I think this is a good opportunity to explain some of this and put it in proper perspective. So and I've got probably a few more slides than I should. I know we're on a short schedule here, but I'll buzz through a few of these coming out of the gate. A lot of these were presented by the OMB director and the OMB division in the committees, finance committees, and you'll see a lot more of this over the coming month or two. But the core programs for the governor are public safety, management of natural resources, and transportation infrastructure. So his number one issue is expenditures cannot exceed revenues. And that's obviously a big hurdle to get over right now. As Mead mentioned, our revenue streams are quite limited, our reserves are limited, and we've been spending beyond our means. So this is something that we would certainly like to bring in on a nice glide path, but we've run out of time. So that's why you're seeing everything taken care of at once in this budget. It's causing quite the interesting conversation in June, obviously, and among Alaskans. But I think it's a conversation that's long overdue. Obviously, protecting the crime issue is a big issue as well that the departments are tackling. And ultimately, sustainable, predictable, and affordable is what we need to put in front of Alaskans and as far as our budget goes. So I've got a couple slides that really tell the story of what we're up against right now. This is, the blue line is revenue, and for some reason the orange line doesn't show on here, but it's expenditures. So you can see in FY13 was the crossover point when revenues went down significantly because of the price of oil, and unfortunately expenditures didn't follow. I'm not going to speak to previous administrations or how we're in the position we're in right now, but ultimately we are in this position right now, and we don't have the reserves to fill that gap anymore. So that's why we've ripped off the Band-Aid to tackle the budget issue head on this year. This is a little more information on from the previous slide, but it does show our revenue balances through the years. The blue bar is CVR, the top bar is statutory budget reserve, and then again we have the revenue line and the expenditure line. So as you can see, the last 2 years, not only are expenditures outpacing revenues on an annual basis, but we've depleted our reserves. This is and this is in the revenue sources book as well, but this is a shortened version of the fiscal summary. And what we show is the FY19 management plan, and then the budget that was introduced by Governor Dunleavy on December 15th. And it was largely the previous administration's budget. As we all know, a new governor coming in has a couple weeks to put his budget out. It's customary for them to pick up the previous administration's budget, maybe make a couple changes, but really just introduce that, and then introduce his true budget, which he did on February 13th. So the $1.6 billion is reflected there, and that's the issue that is being debated right now, is how do we fill that. This is the governor's amended budget, and this is how he is tackling that problem. You see the revenues don't change from the previous slide. The fund withdrawal, this is net of the dividend. So the governor is a big supporter of a full dividend. So out of the POMV draw of about $2.9 billion, just short of $2 billion of that would be used for a dividend. So this is the net that would go to state government. This revenue from fiscal notes is another big issue that's going to be debated. That's the petroleum property tax issue that the governor has brought to the state level from all the communities where petroleum property tax is collected. His point of view is that we're in a fiscal crisis right now, and those revenues should be used for all Alaskans. The communities where that infrastructure is housed has been enjoyed by those communities over the last 3 decades, but now it's time to bring that in-house to the state level to share among all Alaskans, all 700,000 plus. So we're showing basically a balanced budget under this scenario. This is also a very interesting slide that really tells a lot of the story. If you added up a lot of these smaller departments, including revenue right there, it's one of the small ones, but if you added up, I think 9 or 10 of these smaller departments, you're not even getting to $500 million in general funds. and we've got a $1.6 billion problem. You can see where the three towers are that Governor Dunleavy has addressed. It's education, it's HNSS, and it's the university. And President Johnsen will certainly speak to this. While that top line is fairly flat, you can tell that the yellow line there is larger. The blue line went down significantly, and this is receipt authority. So he can certainly talk to that. We don't anticipate the ability to fill that tower coming out of the gate, but the receipt authority is there. So this really tells the entire story. You know, we've all heard there's different contingents that have different visions for Alaska. One group will say, give me a full dividend and cut the budget. Well, I don't know if they understood exactly what cutting the budget means, but we're showing them what a reduced budget looks like. And it's quite shocking to some people, but this is what we're up against right now. We don't have the reserves to continue this spending level going forward. That's the bottom line. So now I'll just get to I've got 3 or 4 slides here on some different issues that are pertinent to the group, obviously, when it comes to the fiscal situation. This is our reserve balances as of, so end of fiscal year 17, end of fiscal year 18, and then as of February 15th. So here's the CBR balance, 1.7 billion. We've depleted that obviously over the last several years, and if we really need a shock absorber to remain in place, this is the shock absorber. And anything below 2 billion is getting pretty lean. So Governor Dunleavy's goal is to not touch that unless there's an emergency that comes about. So we have proposed a budget that does not tap the CBR for FY20. We also have the permanent fund earnings reserve, and then the permanent fund corpus. Mr. Richards will probably speak in more depth to that. But as of just this past week, the permanent fund has actually rebounded quite nicely. At the end of December, it had dipped to about 60 billion, and it's back up to almost 65 billion. So it's recovered quite nicely. But again, the earnings reserve is about 16.6 billion, and that's the last account that we can go to touch. And obviously, the governor's position is not to overdraw the earnings reserve, but he's going to follow the statute that's in place, SB 26, the percent of market value calculation, and he is not intending to overdraw that account. So first, towards the unfunded liability is obviously a big issue for the state, and we recently at the ARM board at the January meeting, we did, based on analysis by the actuary, we did make a slight change to the assumptions. They hadn't been changed in quite a while. 8% had been the I think I did that, but maybe I did. But 8% had been the assumed return on the from the ARM board, and it hadn't been touched in quite a while. What the actuaries recommended was leaving the real return at 4.86, which we did, but we did reduce the inflation assumption from 3.14 to 2.5. So that dropped the expected return from 8 to 7.36, which obviously will lead to a higher liability going forward. That's, I believe it's a little over 100 million for FY21 is when this takes effect. But it does move our funding ratio from 78% down to 75%. Now, one thing that's not reflected in here, and it's fairly new, it's an employer group waiver plan. I'm not sure if you folks are familiar with that, but I'll just read a couple notes on that. So it's a program offered by the federal government that provides federal subsidies for prescription drugs for the Retiree Health Trust. So EGWP was adopted by Alaska Care on January 1st of 2019. This was an administrative change to how pharmacy benefits were previously managed for Medicare eligible or retirees and dependents. The pharmacy benefit for Alaska Care retirees remains the same. But the bottom line is the actuaries estimate that this will reduce this liability by about $800 million. So again, it doesn't fill the entire delta that we realized, but it does help with that bottom line. Again, Mead mentioned the tax credit issue. These are the cashable credits. We stopped this program under HB 111, I believe. And what the result was, it capped out, and we are now paying down this liability. And over the last several years, there have been several different attempts on how to tackle this, either a straight out appropriation. That was pulled back when the oil prices were really going down. Just the previous administration put in place a bonding process that would make sense. The state would be held harmless, and then the companies that are due the tax credits would receive a slight haircut, but at least they would be paid off when the bonds were issued. Unfortunately, that got tied up in the legal process. We got a favorable ruling coming out of the Superior Court, but now it's pretty much headed to the Supreme Court, which is just going to add another year to this process. So what we proposed, there was a $100 million placeholder in there for FY19 that rightfully so the previous administration sat on to see where the bond issue was going to go. Got tied up in the courts, therefore when we took over, we decided to cut that $100 million loose and pay off that portion of the tax credits. In the supplemental budget or bill that we previously rolled out, we add another $84 million to that calculation, which is the statutory calculation for FY19 of $184 million. So $100 million was already appropriated. We've added another 84 in the supplemental. And then in 2020's budget, we have about $175 million in pay down of that. And hopefully by that time, the bond issue will have worked through the Supreme Court. We'll get a favorable ruling. We can issue bonds and pay off the rest of that debt. But this is a liability on our books that we're very interested in paying down and eliminating. This is also in our presentation on the revenue sources book, lots of numbers. They're quite small, but really what the top, when we took office on December 3rd, we'd seen some pretty large gyrations in the price of oil. And the previous administration had settled in at $75 for this fiscal year, and the next fiscal year. And through no fault of their own, there were some big swings over about a 2-month period. But we were already seeing the prices coming down significantly, so what we chose to do is just to go back to the spring forecast amount for the price. We didn't have time. We didn't want to pick a number out of thin air and just say we're going with that. We wanted to go back to a number that a lot of effort and a lot of work had gone into. So we went back to the spring forecast number, which is $64 for 2020, and we're estimating about $68 for the fiscal year we're in right now. Actual year to date is around 70, so we're outpacing that by a little bit. I think the price just the other day was $67, so it's, again, we've seen some pretty big swings even over the last couple of months. But again, the bottom line is it's fairly flat and stable. It's 64 for 2020, and it goes up to 77 in 2028. This middle portion is just the UGF expected minus the permanent fund transfer, the POND calculation. And then down here, we reflect that permanent fund draw on an annual basis, which is about $2.9 billion for the coming fiscal year 2020, and it slowly goes up to about $3.3 billion. This is a slide that I just like to end with. It kind of tells the health of the investment climate. So it's capital expenditures on the north slope, and the red line is the ANS price. So I think what I really am encouraged by is we're estimating the price of oil to be fairly steady and climbing, but we've seen some really sharp increases in investment on the North Slope. So even when prices were a little lower, we were still seeing the investment taking place. And you hear about that in Pica and Willow and some really promising, hopefully oil production that will be coming online in the near future. So I think this is another slide that really tells a good story as well. So that's all I have for my presentation. Thank you so much.
As I bring Craig Richards up, I'm going to just reiterate what Bruce had to say on the constitutional budget reserve. Our constitutional budget reserve annual market value is now down to $1.71 billion as of 12/31. I'm just going to ask quickly, what is the investment profile on that? Are you investing that to be able to cash it out in a 1-year time or a 3-year time, or how?
Yeah, it's pretty liquid, lower returns. We need to be flexible with that.
Okay. So, and we don't have a return number up there, but the fact is we keep withdrawing principal. Okay. All right, Mr. Richards, you're on.
Well, thank you. My name is Craig Richards. I'm chairman of the Permanent Fund, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I haven't attended this event before and actually wasn't familiar with it. So when I saw the presentation, I liked it. And I liked it because I found when I've looked at the state's financial picture, the government tends to think like a government. They tend to think in terms of sort of a more cash accounting concept rather than accrual accounting. They tend to think of immediate cash needs and immediate budgeting. And unlike, I think, at least our corporations tend to think, the balance sheet doesn't become a part of the dialogue in a meaningful financial way like it would in a corporation. And in Alaska, that was fine until we got ourselves into a situation where in 2014 oil prices fell and we have, frankly, an abysmal income statement. We have a huge structural deficit. Oil revenues are declined due to production declines and prices declines, and as everyone in this room knows, it doesn't look like it's going to get a lot better, probably ever. So think about what are we going to do to deal with this real negative situation in sort of state incomes relative to its expenses. Well, that's the negative part. There's a very good positive part too, which is the state has an exceptional balance sheet. So while we're not generating the kind of returns maybe we would like, at least in terms of a governmental entity, our balance sheet is pretty good. And I'll start just with the Permanent Fund Corporation. The Permanent Fund Corporation is approximately $65 billion today. Our budget, let's say, is about $5 billion. That means we have in liquid savings, or something that look like liquid savings, roughly 13 times our current budget. In terms of other governmental entities, that makes us, at least when I looked at this a couple years ago in the state, that makes us probably have one of the best balance sheets of any government in the world. Even if you look at Norway, which has $1 trillion sovereign wealth fund, relative to their total budget and relative to their population, their savings account are not as good as Alaska's. So all is not bleak. We do have very good assets, but and it's not just in the Permanent Fund. We also have a very strong natural resource economy. We have a number of public corporations that are capitalized with fairly substantial sums of money that gives us some options. But of course, the negative thing that is occurring is as we continue to have that deficit in our income statement, we are burning down our balance sheet. And we've not only gone through the CDR, but we've gone through other state assets in the amount of something like $15 to $20 billion in the last 4 years. So we're sort of eating our balance sheet to fund the structural deficit. Which brings us to where we are today with the Permanent Fund. So the Permanent Fund, as I said, was $65 billion at the end of fiscal year 18, which is roughly the end of June. It went down a bunch, it came back a bunch, and it's still about that same amount today. So the Permanent Fund obviously experiences market volatility associated primarily with public equity markets, but it always will. Over the long term, that flight path should be growing, and under SB 26, it should be going at the rate of inflation. What SB 26 does is it says you can spend roughly 5% of the Permanent Fund for dividends and for governmental support every year. Well, 5% is about the real return expectation of the fund. So currently, the way the fund is being managed is we're drawing a sustainable amount of the fund for our government and dividends in terms of at least growing the fund at inflation. But we don't really have enough real growth embedded in the amount we're drawing to grow the fund on a real growth basis. So effectively, we're going to preserve, if we continue to do what we're doing now, we're going to preserve the purchasing power of the fund for the next generation, but the next generation won't have more wealth than we do on a purchasing power basis. Of course, assuming all the models work out, and they never do, so we'll see where we go from there. In terms of just last year's performance as measured by fiscal year 18, which is, obviously pretty stale now, but it's still useful information. Statutory income was way up. One, the fund did very well. The markets did well. We also recognized holdings out of two large investments. We sold off our holding assignment property group and Juno Therapeutics, with both realized something like $1 billion. So we got a little pop in statutory net income. Of course, the way it works though is you get that pop of statutory net income and selling off assets, and the consequences is we have much bigger dividends for the next 5 years. Because that's the way the dividends are calculated. So by recognizing those gains and having that statutory net income pop, we'll also be paying a lot more out in dividends, which means less money for the government. Let's see. So all in all, the management of the permanent fund has been going well and continues to go well. The permanent fund uses 3 benchmarks in terms of how it measures performance. The first is just a passive benchmark that says, if you were a sort of a generic fund that had 60% in equity and 30% in fixed income and then 10% in real estate and inflation-adjusted securities, what would your performance be? And historically, we have done pretty well against that benchmark. Similarly, they use a performance benchmark, which says, what is the benchmark? If you take the weighted average of your asset classes, how would you perform relative to the benchmark of all of those asset classes? And again, the permanent fund, depending on the time period, either beats it a little bit or occasionally underperforms a little bit. But by and large, over time, we have tended to perform about at our performance benchmark. And these numbers can jump by 1% just on the time series you use pretty easily. So we've about managed at our benchmark, maybe a little better in terms of our performance benchmark. But as we move to an endowment model, I frankly think that the traditional way that the permanent fund is benchmarked and thinks about benchmarking becomes less and less important relative to the third benchmark we use. And the third benchmark is one that I know Callan doesn't like, staff doesn't particularly like, because they want to measure against how they're doing relative to the markets. The third benchmark is the board stated benchmark, which is inflation plus 5%. That's what the board really sets as the benchmark of what they would like to see the fund returning. And although you'll never hit it in any given year, every year, you do hope that over a medium time series that you will hit that benchmark. And if we don't hit that benchmark, then of course, as I said earlier under SB 26, the real value of the permanent fund will actually begin to fall. We won't keep up with inflation, and the permanent fund will actually begin to stagnate. And it is always a constant and ongoing dialogue about whether CPI plus 5, roughly where SB 26 lands, whether that's sustainable. And if you bring in performance folks, everybody wants to say it's super aggressive. It is aggressive. But ultimately, the Board of Trustees has taken the belief that we can continue to meet that historical mark, and we will continue to analyze whether we do so. And if you look back at, so they've got the since inception number here of CPI plus 5, that's 7.6%. You've had since 1980 about 3% inflation, kind of as the average, a little bit less. So that means that we kind of haven't quite hit CPI plus 5, but I can also say that in the early days of the fund, we were pretty conservatively invested. So those years do drag down very long time series performance numbers. So again, I think that that's just sort of a way to look at it and think that, yeah, it's probably reasonable that we can hit that number. So my next slide here, the last on performance, I don't think it's particularly important to go over the details other than to say that this is fiscal year to date 2019 performance as measured by December 31, and things were looking fairly bleak. We were down 3% as measured against July 1st of 2018, but markets are markets, and things rebounded, and we've now gotten ourselves back to asset under management value pretty much the same $65 billion number he had at the beginning on fiscal year 19. So markets are volatile, and there's not much that can be done about that except for to think about returns in a long-term perspective rather than sort of a short-term asset value today. And finally, this slide was added without my knowledge, but being a good lawyer, I can speak to anything. So I decided to talk about what I found interesting about this slide. And this is a slide of other large sovereign wealth funds throughout the world. And the first point was just the one I wanted to make, which was Alaska at $65 billion is about 20th on this slide, which doesn't overwhelm you until, again, you consider Alaska's population or the relative size of its budget. In which case, if you were to rejigger the slide, Alaska would be probably the #1 position or maybe the #2 position. So Alaska as a saver has done as well as anyone else really has out of a commodity-based economy, at least measured against the size of the sovereign wealth fund. So that was my main takeaway from the slide. Yeah, so that's that. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
Craig, we'll have time for questions at the end. Several, I think we're hosting many of the World Sovereign Wealth Funds in Juneau this summer. And we're interested in seeing if we get a few of them before Commonwealth North, so we're working on that. One question just came forward of how the permanent fund can help enhance investment in Alaska and help the financial industry here. And I know you've spoken to our fiscal group about that before.
I need the whole hour.
All right, and we'll get you that some of the criteria, making a check you have the cash. And Bruce, in terms of the POMV and how it fits with the formula and how you guys manage the POMV is one of the questions that I know we've looked at in the fiscal study group, and it'd be good to amplify today if we have the time. I'm just gonna, before I bring forward Bryan, I just wanted to say our Alaska Mental Health Trust Authority, which is now $686 million in assets, produces about $12 million in rents and royalty income, about $50 million in investment income. This was a trust that was reconstituted in the early 90s from general state land, and if you look at that number, that's $62 million to help address mental health problems in the state. It's a very, very important budget item. I'll just say, as somebody in the private sector, it's been very interesting, and I would even say positive, to have other groups out there putting land on the market and making land available for development in one way or another. And so you have the Mental Health Trust Authority. It's a relatively small player in terms of its assets versus DNR, but it is a significant contributor to, I guess I would say, the HHS budget and the budget of dealing with mental health issues. And when we look at issues as we have here at Commonwealth North on opioid addiction, on alcoholism, on mental health first aid, this is a very, very handy budget to have, which you don't find in a lot of other states. So let's pass that on. And their asset value, without new introductions of land, has grown in the last fiscal year. I also will just speak very quickly to the Alaska Industrial Development and Export Authority. The net position of ADA right now is $1.3 billion. That's up a little bit from FY17. Its operating revenue, again, is about $65 million. Its operating expense, about $40 million. So net income of $25 million, which is 2.5 times what it was last year. And getting back up to the kinds of numbers that you saw in the last 4 or 5 years. Of that, they have a dividend of about $12.9 million to other state agencies that is coming up again from its highest in recent years was in FY14, where they were able to spin off $70 million toward the general budget. And their change in net position this year is up by 13.4 million. I will say that our next speaker is well-versed and well-schooled on the value of being able to strategically come up with a dividend for other other uses in state government as Ada has. And Bryan, why don't you tell us what's happening at the, in Alaska Housing?
Thank you, Mead, and thank you, everybody, for inviting me today. I won't go line by line through this, so I will spare you that. But the points to note are our net position at the top has stayed fairly constant, even though we've seen our activity drop. To give you a little bit of insight into our mortgage activity, post 08-09, when we saw the recession, the national recession hit, and we saw home prices, especially on the East Coast and the West Coast, really drop. We didn't see it in Alaska because we made concerted decisions as well, not just Alaska Housing, but the industry as a whole, to not get into subprime lending, to not get into interest-only loans, to not get into some of the more gimmicky products that we saw on the West Coast and the East Coast, balloon payments, and as a result, when the economy started to weaken, we saw a tremendous amount of foreclosures. So we felt really good about ourselves at that point. We saw a steady housing market, and we didn't see the kinds of foreclosures that you were seeing in the lower 48 until the federal government artificially reduced Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac's interest rates to help out the rest of the country. Now, our competition in the secondary mortgage market, for those of you that don't know, are Fannie and Freddie. We work with the banks, we work with the credit unions, we work with the mortgage companies, and then it's who purchases the mortgage loans, whether it's Alaska Housing or whether it's Fannie and Freddie in DC. So all of a sudden, when the interest rates got so low for Fannie and Freddie that we couldn't compete selling bonds on Wall Street, a huge percentage of our portfolio left. We saw our portfolio for the state, which had traditionally over the last 20 years been 40 to 50% of the state, drop to 12%. So we saw our net income drop, and as you can see when you look at the numbers, we saw the operating revenue dropped. Everything began to drop. We see in the change in net position line of FY12, we were at a minus 39.7. We've now risen it up to 33. We were always operating in the black during those years, but when you work the numbers through our financials, the large dividend we paid to the state every year, we would have to factor in the payments we were making out to different state agencies that were spending our dividend. So once you subtracted out the money that was flowing out on that, we don't have control over a period of years what projects and how the money gets spent of our dividend, we just have to spend it. It worked into the negative when it was really a positive number before that one thing. And so you can see it worked up. You can also see when I came into this job in FY13, our dividend to the state was $7 million. This year it's just shy of $40 million. So we've worked really hard to try to get that number up. We have realized the benefit the state of Alaska gets from our dividend. And to give you a little bit of a apples-to-apples comparison to ADA and HFC, ADA's dividend is basically 25 to 50% of their net income. Gets determined by the board. Ours is 75%, and just a set number. So we're paying a lot more of what we make in than ADA, and that's beneficial to ADA, who gets to keep a lot more of what they make every year, keeps their corporation healthier, more of a challenge for us. But we appreciate the value that we're doing for the state. We appreciate the fiscal challenges over the years, and so we're happy to do that. This is what the point I made before. You saw our net position dipped a little bit, and if you looked out to FY9, FY10, it was a little higher. We saw it slowly dip as interest rates began to recover a little bit. Still very low. We've seen our net position increase. And we made conscious decisions as a result of losing a lot of our portfolio too. We reduced our operating budget, and there's other efforts we made. What a corporation you'd expect to make when the revenue that was coming in became less than we were used to. Our mission is to provide Alaskans access to safe, quality, affordable housing. The reason I put that there is a lot of times I feel like we get defined by our dividend. People are like, well, what's your dividend this year? It's up $10 million. Great, you guys are great. Well, We have a social purpose. We, of course, have our mortgage activity, and right now it's about a quarter of the mortgages in the state. Our bread and butter is first-time home buyers, the exact kind of professionals and others that you would want to put roots down in Alaska. We have a federally mandated, or federal statutes that allow us to sell tax-exempt bonds to fund that program. So that's a huge piece of what we do. About half our portfolio is in rural Alaska. You don't see Fannie and Freddie doing non-conventional financing, so that's a niche we have that would make it very difficult to own a home in rural Alaska if it didn't exist. So that's a big piece of what we do, but we also run all the public housing in the state, which is about 13,000, between 13 and 14,000 Alaskans every night lay their heads down in either an HFC apartment or in an apartment that our vouchers pay for. It's a fully federally funded program, so we own about 1,600 units throughout the state, and we operate about 50,000 housing choice vouchers, which are vouchers that you can take to any private landlord and get an apartment. And so it's paid for by HUD. So when you look at our operating budget that the legislature is going through right now in Juneau, you see about 2/3 of it is federal funds, and then about 1/3 of it are the receipts that we make off our mortgage activity and our investments. So we don't have any state general funds in our operating budget. And then we operate a number of grants and tax credits with the IRS to help with affordable housing and other things. And as you look actually at our operating revenue and you see that it's dropped, another piece of the big drop has been the reduction in money spent on weatherization and the home energy rebate program. We saw over the course of 7 or 8 years about 2/3 of $1 billion in state general fund come to Alaska Housing for those two programs. I'm sure many, if not most of you in the room, probably took advantage of the home energy rebate program. We saw an average of 30% energy reduction per home. Phenomenally successful program, but obviously when we're dealing with the fiscal issues we are today, we had to kind of sunset it because we weren't in a position to be able to run it anymore. But for the time it was there, it did a lot of great things for Alaskans. Long-lasting benefits to the home, not just a kind of a one-shot, which we sometimes saw with energy dividends or other things. Just to touch a little bit on HFC's leadership, our board includes 3 commissioners: the Commissioner of Health and Social Services, Commerce, Community, and Economic Development, and the Department of Revenue. Bruce sits on our board. And then we also have 4 public members, and they all fit specific areas by statute. Brent LaValle of Fairbanks is our board chair. He's a banker that fits the finance and real estate expertise spot on the board. Alan Wilson of Juneau is a home builder that fits that expertise. Olin Harris lives in Anchorage, and he has expertise in senior and affordable housing. And Haven Harris, the rural seat, Haven's from Nome. So we've had good, responsible, engaged board members over the years, and we've also had good regional representation, which I think really helps, because the challenges that you deal with in rural Alaska and building housing in rural Alaska and the challenges you have in Anchorage or some of the other areas are decidedly different. I'll figure this out as in terms of HFC's performance, our mortgage portfolio continues to grow as the interest rates have bumped up a little bit and our tax-exempt programs are more beneficial to the home buyer. We've seen it grow about 10% here in this last year. Our delinquencies and foreclosures remain low, and this is one real bright, shining area of the economy right now in Alaska. The state of Alaska is either 49th or 50th in the country in delinquencies and foreclosures. Wyoming and Alaska go back and forth based on the month. But Alaska Housing's numbers are even lower than Alaska as a whole. And so we're seeing delinquencies, meaning 30 days or over delay in payments, being about a little over 3%, and our foreclosure rate is minuscule. It's less than 1/3 of 1%. So we continue to see a healthy market. We continue to see home values holding, and since we're into year 4 or year 5 of the recession, we thought there might be some kind of a lag with that, but the numbers are actually better today than they were 4 years ago. So things really seem to be holding up. Our public housing funds that we receive from the federal government have remained stable. And I mentioned the statutory dividend has gone up from 7 to just under 40. And here in this last year, it's gone up $10 million from 29 to 39. So that makes meetings with legislators much more calm and energetic than they were when it was $7 million and they were wondering what the heck was going on. And then this is just a snapshot. I thought folks would find it interesting. We talked about, and knowing that Craig was here today, we talked about the benefits of the permanent fund dividend, and we also, there was an article in the paper the other day that talked about the detriments. Some crime goes up when the dividend comes in. But Alaska Housing, we see a definite drop in people catching up on their delinquencies when the permanent fund comes in. So this is over the course of a year. You can see it averages between 3 and 3 3/4% delinquencies. Dips a little bit in March, April, probably when people get their tax refunds back. And then you can see it drop the month of October to almost 0. So people, when they do get their dividends, that are having a hard time keeping up with their bills, really do handle it responsibly and pay their mortgages off. So when we see it down at 3 1/4 before we've even got to October, we know we're really having a good year in terms of low delinquencies, because we know it's only going to get better as the dividend comes in. And with that, Mead, I am done and certainly available for questions later on. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, now we've gone through our natural resource assets, we've gone through our financial assets. We're going to look very quickly at enterprises and ask Jim Johnsen to speak in a minute on one of our biggest enterprise assets. This is a set of numbers to be aware of as you watch the budget discussions in Juneau. The Alaska Marine Highway has net assets of about $1.2 billion, operating revenue, that's ticket sales, of about $47 million, an operating expense of $142 million, so a very large deficit. Last year, their deficit was almost $95 million. That's a number that is fairly consistent. It's lower than some years in the past. It's a little bit higher than it was last year. The Marine Highway is something which I believe the governor announced in his budget announcement, that he wanted to look at public-private partnerships, maybe curtailing some routes after the summer season, but more to come on this enterprise. And it's a very, very important enterprise all over the state. The Alaska Energy Authority has the same board as ADA. It helps develop energy around the state. Its net assets are about $1.5 billion. Its operating revenue was $40 million. Its operating expense was $85 million. So a negative of $45 million. But there is a fund there with investment income of which last year produced $79 million. So overall, the Energy Authority has been positive, and we can get to questions on that if you have any. Years past, we've had Bill O'Leary of the Alaska Railroad Corporation speak with us. The railroad had net assets of $347 million, which is up from last year. Its revenue from trains is up to $110 million, which is not as high as it's been in the past, but significant. With an operating income of about $1 million profit. Their non-operating income, real estate, is about $13 million profit, down slightly from the last year, but up overall in a 5-year trend. And so the Alaska Railroad is profitable with its real estate. The Alaska International Airport System, which is Anchorage and Fairbanks, again, that's another $1 billion asset almost, about $914 million. Its operating revenue was about $148 million. Its operating expense was $10 million more than that, so a negative $10 million operating revenue. That's better than losing $25 million last year, but not as good as losing $2 million the year before. The state's capital contributions to our airports is around $54 million. I saw the Commissioner of Transportation yesterday. I'm sure we'll have him before Commonwealth North sometime soon. The challenge of keeping our regional airport, our local airports open is one that's addressed by the governor's budget. And frankly, our competitive position in the world cargo business. We're still the 5th largest air cargo port in the world. In Alaska, it's a huge employer here. Over 50,000 Alaskans work in aviation, and it's definitely one of the assets that helps stimulate the entire economy. Now I'm going to turn to an asset which, if you think education is expensive, try ignorance. And I'm just going to say we have a University of Alaska president who has graced our podium before. It's a very important asset of the state with tangible and intangible assets. And Jim, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mead, and thanks all for being here today. I really appreciate the emphasis on assets as opposed to the emphasis that appears to be dominant in our state today, which is deficits. I would like to introduce 9.090909% of my boss. We have a member of the Board of Regents here, Daryl Margrave, so thanks for being here today, Daryl. I figured it's numbers, right? So, we've got these, let's see, next slide. There we go. Thank you. So I'll walk through this quickly. Net capital assets of the university, you see they've increased from 12 up to 18 to 1.7 billion. This increase is largely a function of large expansion of facilities, engineering buildings at both Fairbanks and Anchorage, the Alaska Airlines Center here in Anchorage, student housing both in Southeast and here in Anchorage, a combined heat and power plant up in Fairbanks, and an investment in facility maintenance that we have, for these early years, was funded by the state, but recently has not been, and we've been reallocating to take care of our buildings. Endowment investments, these are endowed donations from private individuals. Hopefully many of you have contributed here, so those have increased. Land endowment and other assets. Mead has, thank you Mead for setting me up here. These numbers should be, needless to say, much higher. Mead mentioned the land-grant university without the land. I was in a hearing yesterday with Senate Finance, and the chairman, Senator Stedman, mentioned Rhode Island in passing. Now, he didn't mention it in relation to the land grant, but he did mention it, so I thought, thank you, sir, I'm going to anchor a comment. And I mentioned to the committee that Rhode Island got a larger land grant than Alaska did. And somebody in their testimony yesterday compared us as a university to Oregon and Washington and California, so I thought, oh, what were their land grants like? And Oregon's was 18 times ours in percentage of the state's land grant. California's was 20 times larger than ours, and Washington was 100 times larger than ours. So if we had Washington's share of the state's land grant, we'd have 11 million acres as opposed to 110,000 acres. Or Oregon's 2 million acres. And this has been a problem since 1915, when we were included by Congress as a land-grant university. And then fast forward to statehood, when Congress abrogated our land-grant rights and said, you get your land from the state. And then we have this pesky provision of the state's constitution which prohibits the dedication of funds, including land, we learned in 2009. So we're still that poor university without the land. And what that means historically is we've had to rely on the state for operating revenues to an extent that you don't see in other states. We are working that issue. I think we've got a good plan, but that's a challenge. And then here, endowment investment return. These are simply the market rates that we've received on our investments. Here's some depressing figures. Number one here is our fall student headcount. You see it has declined rather steadily over the last number of years. This tracks reduction in investment by the state in higher education. It also tracks the demographic decline of Alaska. I think some of you may have seen an editorial I wrote recently in the papers where a friend of mine years ago, commenting on a class I was teaching in political geography, I was excited talking about all the variables that go into understanding a country or a place. And he said, Jim, you only need to know one thing about a country. Are people trying to get in, or are they trying to get out? Everything else is just details. And over the last 6 years anyway, in Alaska, they've been trying to get out. And that's certainly the case, unfortunately, in our university as well. degrees awarded have actually stayed relatively steady compared to the overall enrollment decline. So we've been doing a better job in terms of degree completion. High school, college concurrent enrollment, this is a really good story here and is only going to get better, I think, as we work together at the university with K-12 across the state to get those college-ready high schoolers taking university courses. A very positive relationship with the Mat-Su-Borough School District and the Anchorage School District right now with UAA in particular, with these little college high schools. And then we have also across the state variants of dual enrollment. Kenai Borough, for example, subsidizes the tuition of its college-ready high schoolers coming to Kenai Peninsula College. The RAHI program you may have heard of, the Rural Alaska Honors Institute, a great summer program that prepares kids for college. The ANSET program actually is a dual enrollment program when those kids are in high school. And there are others across the state. There is legislation this year that Senator Gary Stevens is sponsoring to actually strengthen this program. So that's good news. On the tuition and fee front, which is a substantial portion of our revenue, you see how we compare with other states. This is our university tuition, so we're under the Western states average. We use the Western states because typically that's about where 90% of our kids who leave Alaska for college, they stay within those states. I would note for full disclosure, our community college or community campus tuition is about double the national average since the 80s, when the last time we went through a fiscal crisis, we pulled our community colleges and our universities together. So that's something I'm very concerned about, and the Board of Regents is concerned about too. So we took one step in a positive direction last year by discounting tuition in high demand, high workforce demand occupational endorsements by 25%. And I'd like us to be able to do more of that. I'll talk more about our restricted financial envelope, at least what's being talked about in Juneau now, which would really constrain our ability to bring that community campus tuition down to a more competitive level. Research expenditures have been pretty constant here. I want to make a couple of real important points here. One is this $150.7 million, that's a return on a $25 million state investment in research. So that's about a 1 to 6 return, so critically important financially. There are a lot of jobs tied to that money, obviously. There's quality of what's happening academically as a result of that. A lot of that purchasing happens in Alaska. So there's a multiplier effect there too. In addition to that, when we look long term and we look out into the future, this is something the university needs to do much more of, is more of this research and also focus on commercialization of the intellectual property that our faculty develop. I'm happy to announce, many of you know John Wanamaker, a local entrepreneur. John last month agreed to join the university as our first ever Chief Innovation Officer. And so John is working with our faculty here at UAA, UAS, at UAF, learning about their ideas, learning about their intellectual property, and then beginning a process of shopping that to folks with money. Folks willing to invest and grow companies across the street from the university so we can diversify our economy and really create pull in our economy here in Alaska. So again, it'll be, I think, a long-term process here of creating that economic pull that will bring students through education in K-12 and then to the university. This is critically important because we have the lowest college going rate of any state in America today. So if we had 100 average ninth graders in this room, only 33 would go on to college, in Alaska or outside of Alaska. And I mean college, I don't just mean I'm going after a PhD. I mean, I want to get a welding certificate is included in that. So that's not a good number for our state, and that's the number that keeps me up at night. Hence the real critical importance of partnering with K-12 and creating more pathways for our high schoolers into some form of post-secondary education. Again, it can be vocational technical, culinary arts degree, great thing to do, or a degree in health informatics, which would be a fun thing to do here in the future. Here's, let's see, I skipped the slide, I think. Nope, it's not here. Maybe it's, this is the one I want to hit right now. Unrestricted general fund history. The blue here is the UGF that we get from the state. Yes, we get tuition, which is on top of this. Yes, we get restricted grants and contracts revenue, which is on top of this. But this is our core funding. This is the seed corn that everything else comes off of. And you see the blue is that decline from the state. Got a little bit last year. But 4 out of the last 5 years we've been hit. And the governor's proposal there is on the far right. The orange is the lost revenue from where we had been in FY14, and that cumulative impact as of last year was $195 million. Here it would be $380 million of less revenue to the university cumulatively over this period. So I think that gives you a pretty healthy sense of the serious financial hit that we've taken. We've reduced people, not just empty PCNs, not a bureaucratic game, over this period of 1,283 across the university system. And if this budget is enacted and put into effect, I think the impact would be easily that again. And in fact, I think it would be more because we would have fewer people teaching, so fewer classes, less enrollment, fewer programs, etc. So tuition revenue would be hit negatively, as well as research grants and contracts revenue. That would also be hit, I would predict. Back here, well, how we've been dealing with some of these crises. Well, one thing is you probably heard about this process a couple of years ago. I got scars on my back from driving this process, but we made a lot of good decisions, I think, in terms of focusing our universities on their primary mission. So yes, we are one university system overall, corporate, financially, we're one employer, but in terms of our academics, we're really 3 universities, and that's what is described here in the middle section of this table. And then at the bottom, what kinds of things do we share? And so we've really been working hard on reducing administration. In fact, the evil statewide administration, my office, was reduced 38% over the last couple of years compared to a 16% reduction across the university system. Then down here in the bottom, again, what can we share? Can we do things as simple yet apparently complex as having a common calendar, as having common course blocks, as having common course numbers, etc. For those of us who spent time out in the business sector, it's difficult to imagine why it would be so hard. It is difficult, but we have made progress. I would say with this current budget, we will certainly be dusting off some of the more extreme options that were generated through this process that we put on the side. Those will be coming back, no question about it. Assuming constant funding, this is what the Board of Regents set out as the university's goals out to 2025 with measures for each one of these 5 goals. I think the goals are pretty hard to disagree with, right? Let's contribute to economic development, workforce development, research, educational attainment, and cost effectiveness. But these again assume reasonable funding. If that doesn't happen, then just like in any business, we will not be able to hit these numbers because we won't have the investment in order to perform to these numbers. But these are core for us. Every budget initiative that comes forward and that the Board of Regents advances to the governor, to the legislature, line right up with these priorities right here, just as they would in your business. And these meet, I would argue, very important state needs here. So we didn't just make these up. We thought very carefully about what we feel our state needs and how we could support that. So I'm going to close here with some really interesting creative work we've been doing at the university. You know, we often do planning in a very short term. You know, we do SWOT, right? SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, and we think about our future in 1 year, 3 year, 5 year stretches. And one of the things the Board of Regents led this summer, and we're continuing to work on this, is a 22-year vision. So what's the University of Alaska going to look like in 2040? So we got together leaders across the state. We engaged a firm that does a process called world building. And they work with the United Nations, they work with Ford Motor Company and others on envisioning futures. And so these are film designers and game designers who come together and go through this very interesting protocol of asking questions, what if, fill in the blank, why not, fill in the blank. And so we went through that process and designed a website. And that website will be accessible, Robbie, on my website right now?
Yes.
Or, okay, great. So you can go to my website and connect to this and cruise around. It's an interactive website. You can follow these 6 characters whose stories we made up. What if Gloria here was an ANSET graduate and won a Nobel Prize? And why not the Seawolf and Nanook hockey team, women's hockey teams playing for the national championship. Why not figure out fetal alcohol syndrome, or how to get heavy oil out of Prudhoe Bay, or on and on and on and on and on. Well, when you're not constrained by today's thinking, you can envision 20 years out, and those are not crazy things to imagine that we have taken care of in 20 years. So again, it's interactive. You can follow a lot of these new institutes and centers and degree programs that we've envisioned. But I think what's really important about this is the students are at the core of this. We're thinking about a paradigm shift. So instead of students being forced to navigate our bureaucratic nightmare, we are bringing our programs and services to students where they are, when they are, and how they want those programs to be delivered to them. So that's the paradigm shift we're envisioning 20 years out. I think that's exactly how we can lead Alaska going forward. I'll just close with a little story. I mentioned the Rawhide program. When things get really bleak in my job, my escape is a classroom, and I can spend time with students and remember why it is we're here. And so last summer I went into the Rawhide room, and there were about 70 kids from rural Alaska there, mostly Alaska Native kids. And these kids are bright, and they come to us for college, and they do better than our average students do. It's really a super program. So I got on the whiteboard, and I just put out all the terrible numbers. And I said, hey guys, you're the student success, Alaska Student Success Consultancy. Tell me, how do we do this? Solve the problems here. And we had this great 90-minute conversation with the students. And then it was nearing the end, and this young man off in the corner here was quiet the whole time. And he sort of meekly raised his hand right at the end, when I asked any other great ideas. And he raised his hand and he said, yes. And I called on him, and he said, we need a high growth mindset in Alaska. Yes, we need a high growth mindset in Alaska. And of course, the only way we're going to be able to manifest that high growth mindset in Alaska is through education. So thanks very much for your patience. I appreciate it.
Well, Jim, thank you very much. And let me say this: this program always runs over a little bit, and it's been a great program today. We do have some questions. I'm going to pass the mic to our various speakers. And I also just, before we do that, I'd like to thank Aaron Weddle. Is Aaron here? Where's Aaron? Aaron, thank you for putting these slides together. You've faithfully worked on this project for a number of years. The Commonwealth North, you've been tracking these assets over time. And let's have a round of applause for Aaron. There is much in these slides. The slides are available for you to download at the Commonwealth North website, and I just want to make sure that people were aware of that. So questions. One of the first questions is, we'll throw it out for the administration official who's here. Bruce, what happens to delinquencies? Actually, this maybe is to you and to Bryan. What happens to delinquencies if the governor's budget goes forward with 10,000 job losses? Now that's the question. I don't know who asked the question. Delinquencies in the mortgage area. And,
Well, yeah. So, for those of you that were here in the 80s, you might remember when I think there were a lot of people screaming, cut the budget, it's too big, a number of other things, and I think a lot of people weren't really aware of how the economy was connected to them, if they weren't a state employee or they weren't a municipal employee. But what happened was, and the vast majority of the job losses were not in government, but it all added up, and within a year we saw the home values drop in half. So all of a sudden, like a good friend of mine had just bought a house in East Anchorage for $120,000. It was now being appraised at $55,000. So he owed over twice on his mortgage what the value of the home was. We saw thousands of foreclosures at HFC. And so that's kind of the extreme example of what happens when we lose a lot of jobs. Now, I think a lot of people predicted that doom and gloom 4 years ago, and we haven't seen it. But I think if we were to see, I mean, if those kinds of numbers, and I have no idea if 10 or 1,000 or whatever is accurate through this whole thing, that is an area that we're concerned about, simply because at that point, the entire population understands how small our population is and how interconnected our economy is. But we've already learned that lesson once, and hopefully we don't have to learn it a second time to realize, you know, that we all need to work together to come up with the best possible solutions.
Thank you. One of the questions that was asked of Jim Johnsen is, Jim, can you speak to the work you've put in with education commissioners and school districts over the last 4 years, and what's changed as we've been dealing with deficits over the last 5 years?
Well, thanks very much, Mead. I think the one good answer here is that dual enrollment number there. These programs with K-12, we've tried to get in sync what we think a college-ready student is and what high schools think a college-ready student is, because those are not necessarily in sync. When I came into the job, fingers were pointing at each other, and actually it was here at Commonwealth North early on in my time in the job when DEED, State Education Commissioner Michael Johnsen, and I spoke here. We cut a deal where we're not pointing fingers at each other, because as you know, when you're pointing fingers at somebody, there are several more fingers pointing back at you. We made the pledge that we would support each other. So we went on a bit of a road show, and we spent a lot of time working together, again, trying to drive this dual enrollment piece in particular. So that's a biggie. There are other things we've done together. Well, let's be clear, most recently, the debacle of the loss of accreditation for the initial licensure programs at UAA's teacher education school. Because of the close relationship we have with Michael and the board, we very quickly were able to take care of those students in a sort of crisis mode, if you will, making sure those students who are seniors graduating this spring and summer are going to be licensed. That doesn't happen without a strong relationship there. And you don't want to have to rely on it for that kind of purpose, obviously. That's a terrible thing that occurred there. But I think that's an example of this positive relationship. And I see us working, again, together more and more down the road. Teacher education is critical. Alaska-trained teachers turn over a much lower rate, they cost school districts less, and the kids do better. So it's what a friend of mine used to call a self-licking ice cream cone. And that's why I think we make it a very important priority. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. One other quick question on the university. I notice your what-if diagram does not include a law program on that last constellation. Is there any chance we could stop being the only state in the nation that doesn't have a law program? And I'm just going to ask, while you're at it, the governor's budget cut proposal said that we're not getting our money's worth from the medical program, the WAMI program, in terms of doctors returning to the state. And so I wonder if you could comment on both.
A law school would be very expensive, as I'm told by by folks who looked into this about 10 years ago, that you actually have to have a dedicated physical library to support a law school. You can't just borrow the state law department's library. You have to have your own brick and mortar books on shelves law school, extremely expensive. And I've talked with friends of mine I do have friends who are lawyers, and I've talked with friends of mine who say, no, not a good plan, and others who have advocated for it. So, but in this climate, my view is that the question is not, do we have a law school? The question is, frankly, what programs that we currently offer are we not going to offer in Alaska anymore? Because $134 million general fund cut, that's not, get a little trimmer, Jim, reduce your faculty just a little bit, take one out here, one out there. No, this is very big. So I think that's more the question, frankly. In terms of WAMI, I think we've got very, very good numbers in terms of the return on those people who do residencies here in Alaska, whether they study at UAA's WAMI program or some other, but if they do their residency here, they stay at very high rates. I don't have the numbers right off the top of my head, but I think it's been a very successful program, and I would hate to see it be eliminated. I do know that there are many people who've been impacted by this budget proposal, and maybe that's a good thing because it has certainly brought a lot of people together. in a desire to engage in the debate and engage in advocacy.
Thanks, Jim. I'm going to now shift to Craig for a second. Craig, I asked you while we're sitting next to each other, what does the permanent fund spend in managing its money? I think you told me it was about $400 million on outside money managers and about $20 million a year on your internal budget. How can we use the permanent fund to enhance investment in Alaska?
So the board has recently adopted 2 initiatives that would try to do that in very measured and calculated and well-known ways. The first one is they set up what's called an emerging manager program, where we've allocated $200 million of the $65 billion in the future to private equity and venture capital. For instance, the president talked about the universities trying to start up basically a venture capital entrepreneur program. That would be the kind of program that the university could work with, as well as other private equity individuals. That program is managed, is going to be managed, have a picked manager is going to be externally outside of permanent fund staff, so that the external managers have the same requirements to meet the same return hurdles as the rest of all the permanent fund's external managers do. And then the other thing the permanent fund has done is they've set sort of this aspirational target goal of moving the amount under management in the state from about 1.5% to 5% by 2023. So those are the 2 things we've done to, one, do what a lot of other states and pension funds have done, is where you set up these emerging manager programs, and then the second is to sort of begin at least starting the dialogue, is it possible to increase by a factor of 100 to 200% how much of the assets the permanent fund has that are managed externally, how much of that's done in state. So in terms of other initiatives, that was a lot for the permanent fund to swallow. That was a lot of change. So we're going to, as far as I know, you never know what the next board's going to do. As far as this board, we're going to give that probably a couple of years to sort of develop and foment and see how it does. In particular, I think the move towards co-investing in the private equity space with outside private equity investors in Alaska, that $200 million portion, I think it'll take probably 3 to 4 years to really see if the program succeeds or fails. So there'll be some time before that gets there. But within that space, there's a lot of opportunity to work with that external manager for people like the university, for people that manage private equity in the state, and for some of our native corporations to basically figure out how to co-invest alongside the permanent fund. So it's a small piece, but it's an exciting piece.
All right, thank you. I'm going to finish today's program with 2 questions, and I'm going to pass the mic starting with Bryan. What happens if we don't balance our budget and completely exhaust our reserves or run into debt? What assets could should Alaska sell to cover near-term revenue gaps? And while we're at it, Jim, and when you get the microphone, tell us how the university is going to get its land. But Bryan, any wrap-up words?
Well, that's easy. My solution for the state of Alaska is, well, I think that if there's one real positive to the governor's budget, like it just been mentioned by a few folks, it's getting people talking. And the point I was trying to make with we're all connected by our homes is that everybody needs to get engaged, and if you think that there's a reason why you don't need to, you're going to find out that's false. So I think clearly we can't keep spending what we're spending. Clearly we have to determine what we believe the size of the permanent fund dividend check should be and handle that. And it's just something that everybody needs to weigh in on, because if you don't have a role in trying to determine how everything gets right-sized, then you really don't, you're limited on the amount of complaining you can do when it's not exactly the way you think it should be. How's that for a political answer?
Well, what can we sell? Certainly we can step up selling intellectual property and that sort of thing and create more market value. We can sell relevance of our educational programs. We need to come up with new programs, I think, that are more exciting, like those you saw there in terms of that Capital Institute, drones, all sorts of cool stuff. And I think our young people want to see programs like that. E-gaming, for example, is something that's got some legs right now. We can certainly sell more land. We'll be probably selling some buildings here in Anchorage soon if this budget situation continues. They give us a one-time pop, but we'll certainly keep pushing on that. In terms of the land, we've got a strategy right now that involves The state's got something like 5 million acres of land that it is still due from Congress, and the governor has made that a top priority, as Bruce mentioned. The delegation in DC is very interested in moving this forward. Senator Murkowski is perfectly positioned to help with this, and as well, former DNR Commissioner Joe Bailash is in a great spot to help us with this. So basically the plan is that we would select lands from the state's selected, not yet conveyed lands. And that way, the state's not giving us the land, but at the same time, the feds aren't giving us any additional land that is not due the state. So that's the rather simple plan, but it's been a plan that's been sort of hanging out there for 103 years. But hopefully we'll move that forward quickly. Thank you.
So I think one of the biggest upsides of the budget process we're going through, despite how painful it is the fact that we are turning the conversation on its head. We spent, I don't know how many special sessions over the last couple of years arguing over $10 million cuts here and there. And in the meantime, we were $1 billion deficits. So I think what we're seeing now is, here's how much revenue we have, folks, and here's what this government proposes to do with that revenue. Now we've got a whole pile of stuff over on the side that didn't make it into the budget. And now the debate begins. If you want to bring something back to the table, how much is it going to cost, and how are we going to pay for it? So instead of arguing over $10 million cuts here and there, we're just cutting right to the chase. Here's the revenue, here's the expenses that this governor believes in, and let the debate begin. We're going to see a lot of discussions around the economics and the analysis and job losses, which will certainly be interesting. We've seen 10,000 plus private sector jobs, or total jobs, leave the state in the last couple of years. So I think part of this governor's perspective is you can't extract enough revenue out of Alaskans to support the budget that we had last year. 1.6 billion is a big, big number. So cuts have to be part of the equation. Our new revenue is going to be part of the discussion. The governor is certainly open to having that discussion. That's the whole point of this discussion, is to engage Alaskans. Do you want a full dividend? This is what the budget looks like. Now, do you want to talk about bringing revenues to the table to fund specific items? It's a discussion that we've never had in this state, I don't think, on that specific of a level. So I think that's what we're going to see over the coming months, is how that progresses and what Alaskans believe are their priorities.
Thank you. Mr. Richards, any further words?
Just thank you for the chance to be here.
All right, well, I'm going to invite Terry up to the podium. Terry, we don't have a gavel here, so I'm just going to hand you the microphone. But I just want to say it's been my honor and pleasure to be your president for 2 years. I took off a little bit of time to run around the campaign trail with Edie and the governor and some others, and came back to Commonwealth North. But Terry held the reins at that time and has done a fantastic job. And I just want to say that I happened to be present when this organization was founded in the late 70s. And if I take a look at the kinds of reports we've done, the kinds of forums we've had like we've had today, the kind of attention that we've given to the common assets of the state, I just have to thank you for being involved. And if you're not a member, I invite you to be a member again. We come up, this year is the 100th. We've already passed Bill Egan's centenary. It's Governor Hickel's centenary in August. We'll probably have a Hickel Award dinner, which is going to be a magnificent event. And please stay involved with Commonwealth North. We need you, and I will respectfully say you need us. So thank you very much, and Terry, it's all yours.
And another round of applause for Mead and his stewardship over the last 2 years, taking one for the team, and so we've appreciated all of your insight in bringing that legacy forward, and we're looking forward to you staying involved and all of you getting involved as well. If you're not a member, please join, and have a great day.